I guess we can start pretty soon in any case. I guess, would you like to first start out by just introducing yourself and a little bit about what kind of your areas of research are?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks also, Dejan. I don't think he's on the call yet, but I understand he was instrumental in putting this together. So I really appreciate it. I teach, I'm an associate professor of political science, teach political theory at Morehouse, published two books. My most recent book, 2019, W.B. Du Bois and the Critique of the Competitive Society. And I've got another one coming out in April it's called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. And my work over the last 4 or 5 years really has had to do with racial capitalism and Black radicalism in the 20th century. I was trained, broadly in sort of Marxism and the critical theory tradition, but have really become more interested in sort of Black radical articulations of that tradition. That's where I am. Very excited about this book coming out in April on King that I co-authored with a former student, Jared Loggins, who's now up in the PhD program at Brown. So that's a bit about me. And I'm sure I'll get a chance to say a little bit more about some of my work as we move forward.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess sort of kind of the first question on hand, this is kind of based on at least some cursory readings of your work. So a lot of your work seems to be very centered around the relationship between labor movements in the early 20th century and also various civil rights movements around the same era. But so given the weakening of labor power that we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 30 years, what are some ways in which we can see the effects of the trends in labor power in the racialized effects of capitalism today?
Yeah. Well, so I do think, I think what we're seeing really is, transformation of global capitalism over the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st. So it's not so much that the labor movement has been weakened. I think the conditions for labor organizing have changed. The role of the state as a manager of racial inequity in capitalism has stayed constant, but the techniques have changed. So in the mid 20th century, the welfare state was sort of the site at which, sort of technologies to manage racial inequity were playing out. In the mid 20th century, labor was still relatively organized by capital in the United States and in other so-called advanced economies in a way that made industrial organizing and workplace organizing more possible than it is now. But with the advent of globalization, that has simply spread the site of labor organizing around the world in ways that have made it much more complicated and more difficult to organize and build up organizational capacity in the labor movement. But the state also has transitioned from managing capital through the welfare state to managing racial capital, through technologies of policing and incarceration. And so that has, changed the ways in which people resist state power, so that we see, resistance movements today that don't appear to be labor movements, but appear to be movements taking aim at, policing, police brutality, mass incarceration, and that they are. But of course, what that is sort of below the surface is sort of contemporary manifestations of, organizing against capital. I mean, it's just a reflection of the fact that global capital has changed and has transformed itself, and the kinds of modes of resistance that we see have to change accordingly. So I actually don't think that we've seen, a weakening of resistance struggles. I just think that we're moving through some changing phases in global capitalism that have shaken up the ways in which, resistance is organized. And I think we're still clinging in some ways to kind of outmoded models for thinking about what anti-capitalist organizing looks like and must look like. And the kinds of protest movements that we're seeing today don't necessarily fit that mold perfectly. And I think we have some conceptual work to do as interpreters, as analysts, as commentators on our situation, to try to figure out how to understand the nature of anti-capitalist resistance today. So I'll stop there. I think there's a lot more to be said about the racial nature of capital and how that has changed, but I think we can get into that maybe via another question. Or if there's a follow-up to that, I certainly welcome.
Nikhil, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Just as a kind of a follow-up to that question, I know something you mentioned there is that the mode of the modes of capitalism have changed such that I guess a specifically a lens of looking at it through kind of a labor struggle, such as I guess a movement centered around unions or other forms of organized labor, is no longer, I guess, either the effective or the dominant way of resisting the effects of modern capitalism.
Yeah.
I guess, what are some forces you would attribute towards creating that kind of change?
Yeah, well, don't get me wrong. I don't want to suggest that unions and sort of conventional labor organizing is not effective. I just think that it is, in the mid 20th century, it was clearly the dominant sort of mode of anti-capitalist organizing, and could be aligned with racial struggles and other sort of so-called social justice struggles in ways that today it's a little bit more complicated to see that connection. And I just, so the question is, how has capitalism changed, or what are some of the forces that have brought about this change? Well, the one that is often cited is simply the decline in profitability system-wide that was initiated in the 70s and really continues into this, this sort of mid 20th century era of really significant economic growth that produced a certain level of profitability for capitalists, such that they were able to kind of, throw some crumbs down to the working classes. I mean, that age has come and gone, and we've been sort of stuck in this productivity decline for several decades now. And part of what this has led to is financialization, that firms are looking for alternative modes of profitability. Sort of traditional productive enterprise is not as profitable as regime of capital accumulation needs it to be. And so increasingly we've seen what Marx called fictitious capital kind of pumping up the system. And so this is debt incumbency, both consumer debt, but also sovereign debt, has been driving sort of the circuits of profitability for several decades. And this has had a number of effects. I mean, on the one hand, it's made states, democratic states, less accountable to their citizenry, less accountable to civil society organizations, less accountable to labor unions, because they've reduce their dependency on the tax base and increase their dependency on an international class of financiers. And so what you have in the rich countries are increasingly governments that are more beholden to international financiers than they are to their own citizenry. And that has I think given states license to kind of roll back services that they provide for their citizenry. And that, of course, has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable populations, Black and brown populations in this country, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll stop there, but I think that's the big one, is this sort of notion of financialization that that so many people sort of point to as the sort of nature of globalized capitalism in this neoliberal age.
Yeah, so we actually have an audience question kind of on that note. Dejan is actually asking, would you say the increase in corporations enforcing subscription-based services on their previously flat rate cost services is a form of fictitious capitalism?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the idea of fictitious capital, there's a great
Perhaps we should
book.
define terms here, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there's a great book on this by a French economist named Cedric Durand. Came out a few years ago called Fictitious Capital. That he does a really good job of sort of using, which is a Marxist term, but he does a really good job of showing how it's actually compatible with several different schools of economic thought, and it really helps us sort of get it at the ways in which the profitability of capitalism today is less dependent upon productive output and more dependent upon essentially extending promises to pay into the future, right? And so getting people into debt, getting countries into debt, basically sort of gambling on the future. And so I don't know that subscription services are a form of that. Whenever you start talking about credit and extending people lines of credit and they go into debt, then we start talking about fictitious capital, capital that is accumulated in the moment on the promise that it will be paid into the future.
I'm curious, would you consider, I guess, a lot of the Silicon Valley gig economy to kind of fall into this category? I know Uber, for example,
Mm-hmm.
It still hasn't reached profitability, but
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of
Yeah.
kind of part of the VC culture. And
Absolutely. So all of this sort of entrepreneurship stuff that we've been seeing over the last, couple of decades fits into this, where, these kind of get rich quick schemes. And we've seen, a number of successful in the sense of, folks have been able to get incredibly wealthy and rich off of this. Quickly, we've seen enough cases of that it's become really seductive, and everybody's trying to get on the next big thing in order to cash out. And so, absolutely, I mean, if you have these companies like Uber that are not profitable, there's no real sense that they will ever become profitable, and yet they are valued in the market at a certain figure, and people are able to cash out on that in real dollars. That is absolutely fictitious capital. Now, the other side of that, of course, we're talking about labor organizing a minute ago, is all the sort of labor sort of consequences of the gig economy, and that's another sort of side of this coin. But yeah, absolutely, and I think so many sort of entrepreneurial ventures fall into this category.
all right, I guess that's definitely kind of an interesting way of looking at a lot of the modern economy and a lot of the sort of the fundamental changes that have happened. And so now kind of going back to part of your response to the initial question about how that sort of necessarily changed the dominant modes of resisting capitalism, how would you sort of characterize in more detail what makes a lot of the modern resistance efforts against capitalism kind of unique from previous generations, and how do they sort of fit within the modern economy as you describe it?
Well, I'll sort of lean on, there's a book that I know is a little controversial, but I really like, Joshua Clover's book, Riot, Strike, Riot. I'm not sure if anyone on the call is familiar with this, but, he makes the argument that, we've gone from a sort of phase where the labor strike was the sort of dominant mode of anti-capitalist resistance because proletarian labor was organized in the industrial workplace. And so because workers were there, that was the site at which capitalist exploitation was occurring. And that was sort of the location at which workers could disrupt circuits of capital accumulation by disrupting the production process. But as we've moved into this phase of neoliberalization and globalization, as sort of industrial production has been spread out in ways that have disorganized labor, and in ways that have caused more and more people who are sort of caught up in the circuits of capital accumulation and consumption and distribution and so forth to sort of be variably situated within this sort of larger set of circuits. increasingly the ways in which people who are not well served by these circuits of capital accumulation find themselves having to disrupt capital accumulation in other ways. And so the riot becomes, for him, once again, he talks about how in pre-capitalist, pre-industrial sort of early capitalism, the riot was the dominant mode of protesting problems over material distribution of wealth. Then it became the labor strike with industrialized capitalism. And now it's become, again, a new kind of riotous protest. And the point he's trying to make there is just that, it's no longer production, disrupting production as the dominant site at which anti-capitalist protest occurs, that it's disrupting circulation. And so we see a range of activities that could all be kind of cataloged as examples of disrupting the circulation of capital, all of which are born from a sense of frustration with the injustices in the material distribution of wealth, right? And so you have populations of people who feel left behind, who are underserved, who do not feel that they are being properly invested in and don't have any real life chances under capitalism, but they're not industrial workers who are really well suited to strike. And so I think that we need to think about expanding our sort of concept of what anti-capitalist protest looks like today. And one thing that I think is good about this is that it helps us see how things like racism are interwoven into the circuits of capital accumulation and distribution. And so I think it's easier for us today to look at protest movements that are explicitly anti-racist as also explicitly anti-capitalist in ways that in the mid-20th century, it was easier for folks to say, well, this is really just an anti-capitalist protest and race is subsidiary to that, or gender is subsidiary to that, because of how sort of anti-capitalist protest has become more complicated. Again, because of the way in which labor is less organized by capital than it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. It actually helps us come to terms with this notion of racial capitalism in ways that I think much of the left in this country and really throughout Western society in the modern period since Marx, it's been easier for them to be class reductionist in ways that it's harder for us to be class reductionist now. And it's easier for us to see the ways in which racism and gendered capitalism function. The ways in which race and racial inequity and racial inequality are both required and reproduced by processes of capital accumulation.
All right. I guess thank you for kind of articulating that. And I think that to sort of provide a segue to our next question, then, if we're sort of talking on one hand about how, the masses resist the nature of the state and the instruments of capital, there's sort of a flip side to this about how kind of the ways in which the state defends itself from those challenges has perhaps changed over time. So during the civil rights movement, the government would often crack down on many Black activists, most notably through the COINTELPRO program, and plus many other kinds of quite horrific actions.
Yeah.
What are your opinions on that potentially happening now? Is that a valid concern? How should we potentially react?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously a valid concern. It's always a valid concern. I think organizers and activists are always in the crosshairs. I don't know that, there's really any difference now than there was 60 years ago. I think what has changed, so, I do think that, the state has always been a manager of capitalism's racial inequities. But I think in the mid-20th century, during the civil rights era, that was a phase of state-managed capitalism where the welfare state was sort of implemented to try to appease labor unrest and buy capitalism a little bit of time to, right? I mean, if you sort of provide enough services and legal protections and so on and so forth, you can sort of quiet labor unrest and forestall, the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. But we know that the welfare state was always racialized, that it was always the white working class that benefited, and black working classes were sort of managed in certain kinds of ways, and that the state, the welfare state, was sort of the site at which struggles over racialized distribution and inequity were fought. I think that's still the case today, but I think, with the decline of the welfare state, we see the sort of technology that the state uses to manage capitalism's racial inequities has changed a little bit. And so it's become increasingly policing and mass incarceration, rather than, the welfare state as that has conventionally been understood. But I think it's, just a different technology that has the same effect, which is that the state manages capitalism's racial inequities, and through violence, through social control, through institutional arrangements, through cultural norms and hegemony and so forth. Activists and organizers have always been chipping away at this, as they should, as they must. And they've always been in the crosshairs. It's always been dangerous work. And I don't know that it's really any different today than it was, in any time in the relatively recent past.
What about with the rise of, I guess, the internet and mass surveillance, as well as the privatization of a lot of these platforms,
right?
Through, I guess, just the nature of groups like Facebook and Twitter being private companies. Right. Do you think that sort of changed the dynamic in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not enough of a social movement scholar to really be able to comment on this. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, the internet has, in sort of digital sort of age, technologies have given tools to organizers and activists that have, enabled them to, to engage in networked protests in ways that are harder to manage and control and manipulate. And so again, I'm not a sufficient scholar to be able to comment on this, but to the point about how, COINTELPRO, for example, going after particular individuals. One thing we have definitely seen change among organizers and activists is, less of an emphasis on sort of vertical organizational structures, right? And more of an emphasis on horizontal networked structures, and one point of that being that it's, if you could remove the head of a hierarchically organized structure, the whole thing collapses. And if you don't have that head sticking out, it's harder to, take one piece out and have the whole thing collapse. And so, I think it's a combination of kind of both sides of the struggle, sort of using new technologies to try to get a leg up. But again, I'm not enough of a scholar to really say definitively how this advent of a new digital age has benefited one side over the other.
Sorry, it appears I'm muted once again. I think those are definitely kind of big factors, especially in a way social movements have adapted, you could say, in response to a lot of those tactics. So I guess now going on to perhaps a question closer to a lot of your ongoing work around Martin Luther King. So as I understand, you're currently in the process of writing a book about his critiques of capitalism. So what are some of those, perhaps to spoil your book ahead of time, what are some of those main critiques, and how do you kind of see to apply them to the modern day?
Well, so, this would normally be shameless self-promotion, but the book is actually going to be an open source free ebook come April. And so, it will cost you nothing to get a hold of this book come April. And so it's done. It's in production right now. I mean, we use the lens, Jared Loggins, my co-author, and I, he's at Brown, a PhD student at Brown. We use the discourse on racial capitalism as a frame to rethink King and to sort of tease out and reconstruct his critique of political economy, his critique of capitalism. There has not been a book that has really focused on King as a critic of capitalism. And so, what we try to do is sort of reconstruct what that critical theory of capitalism that, kind of simmers beneath the surface of his work, what that would entail. And we think that this contemporary discourse on racial capitalism, which of course comes from the tradition of Cedric Robinson, the Black radical tradition, is actually quite helpful and very nicely applicable to King. And so a couple of things. One is that we read King as a pretty radical anti-capitalist consistently throughout his life. That the way he was thrust into the civil rights movement in the 50s in Montgomery, he was elevated to a stage in a way that kind of required him to subdue some of that radicalism when it comes to the economic critique. But by 1965, he becomes much more outspoken about it. And in the last years of his life, as he's self-consciously moving from first phase civil rights struggles, that's his term, first phase, to what he called the second phase, that was more focused on economic issues. We see him become increasingly outspoken in his critique of capitalism, and that critique is pretty expansive. He comes out in '67 against the Vietnam War, and we read his critique of the war and of militarism as essentially a critique of capitalist imperialism. We argue that if you sort of mine his writings from early to late, and especially in late, he has this pretty sophisticated analysis of how racial inequality is both required and reproduced by capital. And we situate him in the Black radical tradition. And so I don't know how many folks on the call here are familiar with Cedric Robinson's work. If you're not familiar with it, I would urge you to take a look at it. And the Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, is foundational text. But he argues that sort of the Black radical tradition rejects the violence, the property ownership, the state-centered conception of the political of the white world. And if you sort of apply that theoretical model onto King, it plays out really, really nicely. That King, despite the fact that he worked pretty consistently within a state-centered conception of the political and sought, electoral politics and legislative victories and so forth, that never exhausted his account of what a kind of Black radical anti-capitalist politics would look like. For him, it was all about community building and bringing about a world that was radically different than the white, racist, capitalist, property owning, violent, militaristic world of Western modernity. And so that's what the book is all about. And, we think it paints an accurate picture of King, but also one that extends King into our moment by bringing, by showing how his sensibilities, his positions on things were strikingly compatible with what organizers and sort of Black insurgent movements today are doing, when they talk about taking aim at racial capitalism.
All right. Well, thank you for that quite comprehensive answer, and I certainly recommend people in the audience check out Professor Douglas's book when that does get released. So I guess now we have some audience questions coming in. So starting with Dejan, this is kind of a long one. So how could social media or technology help to advance one side favorably or the other? So sort of adding to some of the things we talked about earlier. So for example, there are multiple apps like Causes, Quorum, Roots, Goods Unite Us, Reach, etc., which are all apps that help to partisanly organize people both on the left and the right. And how can these apps cause an advantage of one political ideology over another, especially given how many left-leaning companies at this moment are pushing get out the vote initiatives? So
Right.
a lot of content in that question. Thank you very much, Dejan, for asking. But do you want to pick at that?
Yeah, I'm just not enough of a student of social movements and a scholar of social movements or of digital technologies to really feel comfortable responding to this question. I mean, I'll just say this. So I teach a course on politics and protest, and this semester, for the first time, I did teach a couple of chapters of a book by Rainep Tefeki. I think she teaches at UNC, called Twitter and Tear Gas. She looks at sort of the Arab Spring uprisings and some of the struggles in Turkey around 2011, 12. And so she's not focused so much on the US context, but she looks at the ways in which these new technologies of networked protest and so forth, both the benefits and the drawbacks for sort of grassroots insurgencies. So that might be a text to look at.
Do you mind just repeating the name so I can post it in?
Yeah, so Tefeki. Do I have a copy? I don't know if I have it with me. I'm just gonna see if I have it on the shelf over here. I'll just type in the last name.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm pronounced, so Twitter and Tear Gas is the book. Rainep Tefeki.
Okay, and just sort of, perhaps asking a somewhat broader version of this question that might be on sort of terrain you're more familiar with. Are there sort of ways in which kind of developing technologies or new forms of media in the past, certainly perhaps during Martin Luther King's time, perhaps during W.E.B. Du Bois' time, sort of shifted the ways in which, I guess, both capitalism permeated and, I guess, counter-capitalistic actions. For instance, the growth of the telephone or the radio, or is that something you've come across?
Yeah, well, so let me so the direct answer is no, but let me add a comment to this. I mean, my own thinking is that what makes resistance struggles effective, and I agree with sort of classic works of like Francis Fox Piven on this. That disruption at the end of the day is what affects change. And so we talk a lot about and this is relevant for King too, right? Because King is someone who's often caricatured as, sort of this moral philosopher who's trying to persuade his adversaries and his would-be supporters to kind of get on board with a movement or something like that. But what made King's struggles really successful were the material disruptions that the movement sustained, initiated and sustained. So even in Montgomery, the first struggle he was involved in, I mean, that was a boycott of a privately owned city bus line, right? That was causing material disruption for the city. I mean, if you look at his last campaigns that he was involved in, whether it was the Poor People's Campaign that he was killed before he was able to see come to fruition, but the idea there was to get a multiracial coalition of poor people to march on Washington and shut down the city, right? Make it so that the city could not function, right? So it wasn't just soaring oratory. It was about laying bodies out on the line and disrupting the business, essentially, right? Whether that's governmental business or private business. Same thing with when he was killed in Memphis. I mean, that was a sanitation workers strike that was causing real disruption to the city. And so my point here is, regardless of whatever technologies are available, but at the end of the day, when we're talking about capitalism, racial capitalism, it's about disrupting the circuits of capital accumulation. And so, just getting out the message is maybe one part of that, but that's not really the real part of it. I mean, the real part of it is the material disruption. And so whatever the technologies are, if they contribute to material disruption, they will be effective. If they do not, they will be superficial and ineffective.
Sure. All right, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So I guess moving on, we have another question for, I guess somebody asking anonymously. Is there a possibility of anti-racist movements developing in a non-anti-capitalist way? So for instance, offering more limited liberal solutions to racial equality.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't, I personally, I do not think so. I mean, I think that racial capitalism is real. And what I mean by that is that as long as we have capitalism, we're going to have racial inequality. And if you want to get rid of racism, you have to get rid of capitalism. And so, part of what this means is that for me, is that anti-racist struggle, if it's to be effective, must always also be anti-capitalist struggle. And if it's not going to affect the sort of, um, interconnected nature of racial inequality and capitalist inequality. And not just, I mean, the way I phrased that was even inadequate to suggest that these two are two separate things that can be sort of analyzed separately. I don't think that they are.
So I guess how would you characterize, I guess, people who at least purport to bring anti-racist solutions
Mhm.
that uh, don't immediately threaten capital? For instance, large corporations seemingly being in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, or perhaps more liberal or
Yeah,
conservative politicians making seeming gestures in this direction.
yeah,
Uh,
right.
what's the best way to understand those kinds of actions?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just capitalist ideology. I mean, I think it's just, capitalists trying to sell a narrative about capitalism that is untrue, that deliberately obfuscates and causes people to be less outraged by capitalism. But at the end of the day, you can diversify the boardroom, you can diversify the managerial class, um, but I mean, you still have, enlarging numbers of working class and increasingly disposable populations of people that are no longer needed for capital accumulation. And those populations are disproportionately, people of color, um, both domestically and worldwide. And so I think we're just fooling ourselves to think that you can work within capitalism and somehow diversify racially, the inequities that capitalism both requires and reproduces as a matter of course.
Okay, I think that is pretty good way of describing this. Uh, so here we have a new question from the audience, an anonymous attendee. How can Black socialism and Black nationalism coexist? Not in an ethno-state way, of course. And perhaps in addition to answering this, just provide perhaps a little bit of context towards the history of Black nationalist movements in the U.S., perhaps, just in case some of our audience
Mm.
members aren't familiar with the context here.
Yeah, so I think the best example of this today would be like Cooperation Jackson. I mean, this is, the Malcolm X grassroots movement. It's a Black nationalist organization, but it's also a socialist and anti-capitalist organization. It's, multiracial in some sort of ways, but clearly Black led. Um, and so I think that's sort of the best example that comes to mind of an attempt to merge, the richness of Black socialist traditions and Black nationalist traditions. Um,
Do you mind describing a little bit about the history of Cooperation Jackson, just for?
yeah, so I mean, I don't, I'm certainly not an expert on it, but there's a very good book that they put out, and they've got a great website that's full of great stuff. But in Jackson, Mississippi, there's been a movement afoot for some time now, um, to kind of organize, um, some of the most vulnerable and then sort of left behind populations and regions within Jackson. And I'm not from Jackson, can't speak to the situation there. But it's concerned with sustainability. It's concerned with exploiting some of the contradictions of capital, uneven development of capitalist society. So, where financialized or industrial, post-industrial regions like New York City and DC and so forth are extremely wealthy, and places like Jackson, Mississippi are lowest end of the contemporary capitalist value chain. They're sort of looking at ways in which they can sort of take the situation that they find themselves in now and exploit that. So thinking about how uneven geographical development can sort of be turned to right. So instead of looking for kind of high tech ways to develop, they look at thinking about agriculture and rethinking relationship to the land and sort of living off of the land and so forth. And it's really in some interesting ways, but they also sort of blend it with some new technologies, cryptocurrencies, and some new ideas for sort of mutual aid and time banking and things like this, so that if people are uncashed and don't have the capacity to pay cash for services and so forth, they can trade time, they can trade skills. And so it's a really interesting and cooperative and creative sort of movement that's afoot in Jackson. And they have an electoral politics side of it as well. They have the mayorship, working with them, and so I encourage you to check it out. They have a good website, and this book that they put out, Kali Akuno is one of the core authors and one of the lead organizers down there. But I think that's one of the best examples I can think of a really promising approach that tries to blend Black socialism and Black nationalism.
Thank you. So I guess perhaps branching from that topic a little bit, I guess certainly something I know one thing you mentioned earlier in this talk is how kind of as a result of changes in the way the economy has become more globalized, we sort of have to think of the capitalist economy less dominated strictly in terms of industrial production and such. But we've still sort of seen very clear regional differences as well within modern capitalism, even within the US, which is a main power. And certainly the South has historically had a very different sort of economic dynamic as the North. For one, all the trends we mentioned about union power declining have been especially so in the South. Certainly, do you have any sort of insight into kind of how that perhaps relates to perhaps the legacy of Jim Crow or the other kind of consequences of the civil rights struggles in the 60s that have made the South sort of distinguished?
So you're talking about sort of geographical, uneven development and sort of the racial character and qualities of that. Is that what you're getting at?
Right. I guess there's a lot wrapped in that question, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time discussing that. It just came to mind because you mentioned Cooperation Jackson, which is very much responding to the unique material conditions of that area. I guess how could we perhaps extend that sphere a little bit more to the larger South?
Yeah. So South in the U.S. or global South. I know you were sort of thinking that maybe we could address both of those. This is a bit outside my area of expertise as well. But I will just sort of reiterate, part of what I think sort of from a theoretical perspective is so interesting about Cooperation Jackson, and particularly this idea of trying to exploit the contradictions of uneven development. So, several hundred years into global capitalism, we see the effects of uneven geographical development. Right, that the development that we see in the global North, and this translates roughly to the North-South divide in the U.S. as well, with financial capital and so much wealth concentrated in the North, and then sort of the agrarian sort of regions of the South, producing at sort of a low end of that value chain. Like we value the financial products at a certain rate level. And value the inputs of agrarian contributions at a different level. And if you think about how those uneven geographical developments have compounded over generations, it really has made this phenomenon of uneven geographical development a real force to be reckoned with, both domestically in the U.S. and on a global scale. And so, the question is, how can, folks who find themselves on the sort of victim end of, generations of uneven development, underdevelopment, as Walter Rodney and others would put it, how can you exploit those as a way forward toward a more sustainable post-capitalist situation? And it also introduces some really interesting questions that, someone like Samir Amin, the late Samir Amin, who passed away a couple of years ago, was really interested in, this idea of delinking from globalization. That the ways in which different geographical regions of the world have been sort of locked into relationships with one another as a result of globalization. How is it possible for regions to kind of de-link, from this globalized order, which is hierarchical, monopolized, concentrated wealth and power in certain ways? I don't know how to fill in that question substantively, but formally speaking, theoretically speaking, I think those are the questions that we really need to be wrestling with.
Thank you. I think that's a very insightful way of looking at this. So I think we're sort of nearing towards the end of this talk, and I apologize that a lot of my questions have been a little bit outside of your jurisdiction, but I think you've done an excellent job sort of providing kind of a really good framework to deal with these issues, and providing a lot of key ways in which people in the audience can follow up and do their own research
Yeah.
on this kind of stuff. So perhaps starting to move things towards our conclusion with kind of more cooling down questions. What are some classes that you found kind of enjoyable to teach, and what are some of your favorite
Yeah.
topics to research and
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this. I mean, you have put me out of my comfort zone a little bit, and some of that's my own doing. I just sort of figured coming in talking about, racial capitalism, I should talk about capitalism. But, I'm not an economist. I'm was not even trained in political economy. I'm a humanist. I'm a political theorist and an intellectual historian. But I find myself increasingly pushed to, engage political economy, international political economy more and more. And to think in this kind of macro way about the nature and the evolution of global capitalism. And I just think that while I can focus on close textual readings and archival work around a Du Bois or a Martin Luther King or a Walter Rodney or Frantz Fanon or whomever, that work is really limited if we're not also pushing ourselves to situate it within a kind of comprehensive and historically contextualized account of global capitalism and the mode of production. And so the class that I've challenged myself to teach on a couple of occasions is international political economy. And I've done it in a very, humanistic kind of way. Du Bois, of course, taught at Atlanta University on two occasions. It was then when Clark was separate from Atlanta University. They've since merged, but AUC, roughly speaking, on two occasions. And he left in 1910 to go edit the Crisis, which was the NAACP's journal in New York City. But when he came back in 1933, the first class he taught was a course called Karl Marx and the Negro Problem, and that was the language, of course, of 1933. But the point is, he was reading Marx very heavily in this time period, distancing himself from the liberalism of the NAACP, and thinking about sort of race, both in a domestic context in the U.S., but in ways that were deeply connected to his sort of ongoing analysis of global imperialism. And so he taught this class in 1934, and I've tried to replicate that class, at least in spirit. And so I thought that, at a Black college, at an HBCU, at Morehouse with this Du Boisian legacy, it would be fun to try to recreate that class, because 80 years down the road, 90 years down the road, we're still wrestling with the same problems. We still need to sort of bring a Marxian or broadly, anti-capitalist analysis to bear on global capitalism. And so that's been a class that I've taught a couple times. And even though it is outside my wheelhouse, it's one that I really have enjoyed teaching. But I also teach, course on politics and protest. I teach my bread and butter course, Introduction to Political Theory, which I love. I teach a course on Black political thought, which I love. And I'm teaching a new course this semester on debt and democracy that looks at debt and sort of the financialization of global capitalism in the last 40 years, trying to think about what that means for democracy, transformation of democracy, and the prospects for a more democratic future.
All right, so I guess we have a few audience questions that I think we can conclude with.
Okay.
Patrick Darrington is asking, how does a movement against racial capitalism contend with the state and carceral institutions like prisons and police? Can a movement be truly against capitalism if it is not for prison abolition? So, there's a lot of stuff there, but if you feel you have the time.
Yeah. So I think no. I think the answer is no. I don't think that. Oh, the question just disappeared. I was looking at it.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think I remember. Yeah, I mean, I think because of the nature of capitalism today, racial capitalism in particular, and the ways in which the technologies and techniques that the state exercises to discipline racialized populations and to reproduce sort of the norms around racism, such that when we see Black people suffering the consequences of capitalist inequity, the reaction to that is not the same as it would be if you saw white people suffering from that, right? That's all by design. Capitalism needs those differential reactions to human suffering in order to perpetuate itself. And racism, plays the role of reproducing in people's consciousness these different reactions. And it just so happens that the way capitalism has developed has required the state to take on a more active role in shaping what has become an increasingly surplus or disposable population. That population is, of course, racialized. And so the site of anti-capitalist struggle today in countries like the United States is absolutely the carceral state.
All right, thank you. So Dejan, of course, has a couple of really good in-depth questions here, as always. So first question here is, I know that globalization has been somewhat of a left-wing ideal until late recently. The main morale was to avoid the anti-labor ideal where companies would sell off their labors to other countries. How has this ideal shifted in leftist movements to veer away from globalization, and how does that uphold capitalist thoughts around labor even within leftist movements? So there's sort of a lot of history in that question, but
yeah, I mean, this is really a thorny one. I mean, I would not describe globalization as a left-wing ideal. I would describe it as a thoroughly neoliberal ideal that most sort of right-wing folks, it's a capitalist ideal.
And expand there, how does it compare to leftist ideas of internationalism versus?
I gotcha. Okay. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is where we see, some of the, so I think the alternative to this would be sort of protectionist populisms of various sorts. And those can be sort of left leaning, I guess, but they can also, and I think usually are right leaning. And this is what we see with sort of fascistic movements, and what we see with Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and so forth, and so I think that any genuinely left movement today has to be internationalist. In a certain way, but as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned the work of someone like Samir Amin and these arguments about kind of regionalist delinking from the global economy. And I think what he's getting at there is, these are not, ethnic or state-centered solidarities that he's thinking about, but, to a certain extent, internationalist solidarities, but nevertheless regionalist. I mean, there's a lot here. I'm like talking myself into circles here. Let me get back to you on this one, Dejan. and figure out how to, there's just so many moving pieces. I'll figure out how to, I have a coherent response, but it's going to take me some time to articulate it.
All right, no problem. Our next question from an anonymous attendee is, what is the #1 resource you would recommend as an introduction to learning about racial capitalism?
Yeah.
Other than yourself in this case, but
well, no, I mean, so I guess I have two. So there's a very short little essay by Jody Melamed that came out a couple of years ago in a journal. It's called Racial Capitalism, and the journal is Critical Ethnic Studies. And I still to this day, she articulates the concept in a way that is just very easily digestible, and it's a short little piece. So that's a good one. Jody Melamed is the author. Racial Capitalism is the piece. But the bigger one, of course, is sort of the source, which is Cedric Robinson and his book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Now, the caveat there is that while his first chapter of that book is called Racial Capitalism, that book, technically he didn't introduce the term, but he popularized it to the audience that we talk about here. But that book is really both a critique of Marxism and its Eurocentric sort of nature, but also a kind of introduction to what he calls the Black radical tradition. And so it's not so much concerned with giving an analytic of the concept of racial capitalism, but that book is like the Bible for this concept more generally. So that's one that you should have on your shelf and read cover to cover a few times.
Do you mind just posting the title in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, so Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson, and Racial Capitalism.
Out of curiosity, when was this published?
What's that?
What era was this written during?
Well, Racial Capitalism is the piece. So the Jody Melamed piece is a short little journal article from maybe 2015. Black Marxism was originally published in 1980. Was it 1983? It was republished by UNC Press in 2000, but it's as current as ever. And Cedric Robinson just died a couple of years ago, and he's sort of coming. He was prominent during his life, but has taken on even more prominence, I think, in the last couple of years. So there's a new collection of his works that was just published. Verso came out with a Festschrift, or a collection of essays that's really good, called The Futures of Black Radicalism, on Cedric Robinson's work. So just look up Cedric Robinson. He's just a fantastic scholar to be wrestling with.
All right, thank you. So I guess this probably will be our last question for the night, once more from Dejan. Also, with debt and democracy as an ideal, how do you define democratic dictatorship? And how has that been appearing in American politics today? So again, another very comprehensive question there, but really stuff.
Well, I don't know. I mean, democratic dictatorship is not really a term I use. I do have a couple of thoughts on it. One is sort of the way in which, there was a great political theorist by the name of Sheldon Wolin, great democratic theorist. He passed away a few years back, but he has this interpretation of Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, that talks about how, when democratic societies become increasingly individualistic and consumed with kind of private consumerist notions of freedom, that is to say, when we as citizens become more consumed with our private lives and turn our back on the public sphere, that we create the conditions for dictators to sort of slide in through the back door and govern in the context of a so-called democratic, society. So, we still in the U.S. describe ourselves as a democracy, but none of us are really actively participating in governance in any meaningful way. And what that does is create a kind of governance vacuum that a leadership class is able to kind of step in and play puppet master, all while we're sort of proudly patting ourselves on the back for being democratic. So I think there's an element of that that's been going on for basically the history of the United States, but certainly into our own time. But in the context of sort of socialism and thinking about the critique of capitalism. Um, in the context of debt and democracy, I'll offer up a book, Wolfgang Streeck's book. The concept that what is the name of the book? Buying Time: The Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, where he talks about how we've moved from the tax state to the debt state. So this is some of what I was talking about earlier. So Wolfgang Streeck, a really good critical theorist, a German theorist, still working today. I like his analysis of democratic capitalism a lot.
Is that the right book that I posted in
Yeah,
the chat?
that's it. Buying Time, Verso. Yep, for sure. And he makes the argument that because of the way capitalism has evolved over the last 40 and 50 years, I tried to make this point earlier, democratic governments in the rich countries, the northern countries, have become increasingly beholden to what he calls in the German the Marktvolk, or the market people, the international financial class that is essentially buying government bonds. So democracies are less accountable to their citizenry. They do not get the bulk of their finance through taxing their citizenry. Instead, they're getting it in the form of sovereign debt by selling bonds. And so they become increasingly beholden to this class of international investors. And that's a form of de-democratization or anti-democratization, a form of dictatorship, really, under the auspices of the evolving nature of financialized, globalized capitalism over the last 40 and 50 years. And so, I think this idea of a democratic dictatorship where capital is the dictator, you could read that book and that argument and sort of fit it into that concept, perhaps.
All right. I think that probably concludes our panel for today, but certainly I think a lot of what you've said has been very insightful and very informative to a lot of our audience. And hopefully we can look forward to more joint events like this. Perhaps we could have you on or other along with other instructors who are kind of familiar with this topic in depth. I've definitely enjoyed this conversation quite a bit. And once again, I'm sorry if a lot of the questions were not necessarily ones you were ones that were on terrain you were as familiar with, but I think certainly you provided very good insights onto all these topics, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed this very, very much. Much appreciated.
All right. I think so. With that, certainly, I definitely recommend, I guess, learning more about YDSA GT, the AUC YDSA. Recommend following. By the way, I'm Nikhil. I'm from YDSA GT, but really, like, getting this set up really was a joint effort between me and especially Dejan from the AUC YDSA, and certainly many others who helped with this. So I definitely recommend following the AUC YDSA on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you're interested in either of our chapters, there's some links in there for getting more involved. But thank you all very much, and definitely I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
All right, I guess I will end the meeting for now, but hopefully we can have more conversations like this in the future.
Right. Very good. Have a good night. Thank you so much. And yeah, let's follow up for sure.
All right.